Hello and welcome back to Parley, my on-the-spot responses to the prompts you folks submit. This one is from Bionicme. Hope you'll enjoy listening. It's about active versus passive tanking, and specifically, we're using an example for Survivability Part 1 of Valkyr in Warframe. Bionicme says, I've been wanting to talk about this topic for a while, and will certainly, this one's already too long, make multiple Parley on the subject of survivability. In this one, I want to focus on the currently very topical rework of Valkyr in Warframe, which was recently announced. I'm making this parlay like about a month after you submitted it, so I'm sorry if that isn't as topical anymore. I'm sure it still is. Valkyr, currently, possesses by Warframe standards an averagely small pool of health, very weak shields, and a great armor stat which provides passive damage reduction to her health pool. Mitigation. She can give herself a decently significant armor multiplier buff too, but most notably has the ability to become indefinitely entirely invulnerable to damage, with the drawback that if there are enemies nearby when the invulnerability state ends, when you run out of energy probably, she'll take a portion of the damage prevented while it was active, which is hardly ever relevant. Yeah, it's usually not. While her invulnerability is active, the impressive damage reduction she gets from armor doesn't really do anything. She also has a percentage life steal during that time, which just means she'll be topped off after exiting invulnerability. Now, after her proposed rework, she's getting a notable increase to her base armor, twice her original HP, a tripled multiplier on her temporary armor buff, while her invulnerability ability is active, but that ability doesn't make her invulnerable anymore, though at the end of ability damage drawback is also gone. She also got her lifesteal reduced to a flat amount per hit, and gained a bar that stacks up on melee hits and kills that can be consumed to give her temporary invulnerability if she would die. Despite substantially increasing her survivability, and we'll be breaking down how that's happened, these changes have been somewhat controversial with the community, since they ultimately make her weaker in the most extreme circumstances, since the difference between taking very little damage and not taking any damage at all is very significant. Let's just pause and talk about that for a minute. Yes, I think there's a lot to unpack just with the Valkyr situation, but I will be embracing the topic of survivability in general in this parlay. I just thought we could briefly stop and slightly unpack the Valkyr rework situation. The main thing I wanted to focus on is just that I feel the original design may have, I feel like the rework, which I dipped my feet into as well, I had briefly known about this, it seems to me has somewhat jumped over the original potential design intent or functionality of Valkyr's kit. So let's look at it for a second. Why does she have such high damage reduction and lifesteal when she has an ability that makes her indefinitely, entirely invulnerable to damage? With a drawback that if there are enemies nearby when it ends, she'll take a portion of the damage prevented. That just doesn't happen in practice. It's usually very easy with Warframe's parkour to simply jump really high up in the air, and then there will be no enemies nearby because you're 30 feet in the air, and then drop back down potentially into a group of enemies, but not to worry, for the time when it wore off, you were not near anyone. So even if it wasn't just easy to kill everything if you're invulnerable in Warframe, which it is, there's a way to kind of get away from enemies anyway. So what's the deal? Like, why was it designed that way? I think that a place to start with this idea is that developers of games in general often design things in a way that players expect, not in the way that would be good if the players understood the system better, on purpose, because they want the player to feel like they're getting something that is functional and not kind of discordant. Let me explain what I mean. Obviously, if a character can be invulnerable to damage, it doesn't really make sense for them to have a high armor value. Let's just delete the other mechanics. Just imagine a theoretical thing in a game. The character can be invulnerable, so who cares if they have a lot of damage reduction when they're not invulnerable? Do they become uninvulnerable for like meaningful windows of time, perhaps? Hard to say. But the player, a lot of players of games, maybe not people, I mean, not me, and probably not you, statistically, person listening to this video, because you're a person who's taken an interest in this hobby and delved into it enough. It doesn't require delving in that far to realize that that is a bit redundant. But it's worth understanding that a lot of the percentage of total humans playing video games don't think of it that way. They think often in terms of what I'm going to call just theme, rather than relative benefit. If you have an invulnerability ability, investing the least in your defenses gives you the most benefit. Because if you have a lot of defenses, it's arguably less valuable to be invulnerable. But most players don't think of it that way. They think, well, this is a defensive themed character, so why would they have high armor but no other defensive abilities? Well, they don't need them, a more enfranchised player might say. Maybe it's easier to think about if I give a different example of something offensive. A lot of players think, oh, I want to do a lot of damage, so I'm going to build all critical stats. I'm going to build all the critical chance and critical damage I can get. No multi-shot, no status effects, no other effects. I'm just going to build a ton of crits because that does the most damage. That's what says damage on it, right? But with a bit of knowledge of the underlying math that works in almost all video games, not at all specific to Warframe, you would know that it is nearly always the case that that is less damage, much less damage, it depends on the game, usually much less damage, than building a mix of different damage boosts, because they multiply each other. And even though they don't directly say they do damage, multi-shot in Warframe gives you more bullet per bullet, more bullet per trigger pull, or, fire rate moment. And status effects in Warframe often do more damage. Most status effects in most games mostly do more damage. So it's not, while they might not be separate multipliers, it's often relevant in a similar way. And yes, a lot of players know that. Yes, it is obvious if you want to say it that way. But trying to be charitable, it's worth recognizing that many players don't see that as obvious. To them, it seems counterintuitive that to build the most damage, you don't build the most damage. That sounds stupid only for 2 seconds, and then if you think about it at all, it makes sense. But a lot of people don't. They're doing this as a leisure activity, and they have not yet found the fun that can be thinking about their leisure activity a little bit. That's okay. They will have more fun when they do, but they haven't yet. And so a lot of games have a kind of conundrum. They have to design things either in a way that is wrong, but will make sense to players on that surface of the game, or design things in a way that makes actual sense, but may initially seem kind of discordant to players on the surface. Why does this, Warframe's kit or weapons stats have all of these effects that aren't related to what it's supposed to do? Damage or survivability or whatever it is. And I think that's worth keeping in mind. Now, however, part 2. In Valkyr's case, I also want to speculate that there might be something else going on. I mean, the invulnerability ability giving you lifesteal, it's weird, isn't it? That makes me think that they're trying to say, oh, you tank attacks, and then when you've lost health, but you're still alive, you use Valkyr's, invulnerability ability, you can now safely heal up with the lifesteal, but you do have to kill everything or you take some damage back when you end the ability. Now, it doesn't end up working like that in practice because they didn't make a way to stop players from using it all the time. It's an ability you can just keep paying energy for. But you can see how if Valkyr had way more health, a larger health pool, and thus buffer room to use her significant armor damage reduction to mitigate damage, to take damage, and then an invulnerability ability that was just like a 10-second buff, and you do a bunch of damage and heal back up while safe, but you need to make sure to kill as much as possible or you take a little damage back. That could be a compelling gameplay loop. That isn't how Valkyr works. At least, I don't know if her rework has launched or not. Before the rework, for a lot of Valkyr's lifespan in the game, that isn't how it worked. But if it did work that way, there's a way in which that would make a kind of sense. The ultimate is kind of a panic button that you use to tank back up. Now, in many of the situations in Warframe where you want to tank a lot of damage, you end up just taking colossal single hit damage. And so that playstyle wouldn't be good except on a Warframe with a truly massive health pool plus damage reduction. You would need a lot of both. Even the Warframes I can think of that have the most of both of those qualities would occasionally struggle to use that gameplay loop. So you would need to have truly tremendous amounts of health and damage reduction. I'm not sure I think that twice her original HP will be enough unless she has a truly ungodly amount of armor, but maybe she will. I just think it's worth engaging with on the surface level what is going on as far as the mechanics and what might be motivating the developer. I think Valkyr's initial state didn't make much sense. One of the reasons I think Valkyr was, it doesn't really matter, but from a design and power and build options perspective, I think Valkyr was at least one of the worst warframes in the game, and there are many that have jank, so that's really saying something, is because so much of her kit was redundant, and all it served to do was do something that most warframes have standard, which is just stay alive. Many warframes can get that easily from 1 or even 0 abilities, plus they get some utility out of it, and Valkyr had a whole 2 abilities and then a lot of her base stats dedicated just to like a janky way to stay alive. A fine but like excessive and kind of janky way to stay alive. That just like why? And then her other 2 abilities don't do enough to compensate for like basically not even having 2 abilities from a certain perspective. For players that are having trouble staying alive in the very early game, you could imagine this could be a very different story. But in the version of Warframe where you are modding things and progressing through the star chart, my experience has been that that strategy is not effective for very long. Finally, we have the curious case of Valkyr having a small amount of shields. Now, Warframe currently has a mechanic of shield gating, where if you have any shields, you won't get one-shotted and they'll be consumed to give you a brief invulnerability window. So it actually kind of makes sense for a Warframe that's going to be really tanky to have a little bit of shield. And indeed some in the past, more current Warframes who've been really tanky, had a lot of health, had a lot of armor, have had like a token amount of shields a lot of the time, because the way the game is currently designed, that makes you tankier. Anyway, just an interesting thing, because that doesn't quite fit the theme of like durability. Lots of armor, lots of health, and an invulnerability thing. That might be redundant. It could maybe not be, as I also discussed. But another interesting thing to note is she also doesn't totally embrace that theme either. She has very low shields, which she had before the game had the shield gating mechanic. That's a relic of older design. So that I'm not sure that really made that much sense at the time, I guess is what I'm saying. A Berserker themed Warframe, maybe. She doesn't have very many Berserkery abilities. I would argue very little damage increase, for example. You get an attack speed buff on the skill too. Anyway, Valkyr analysis mostly over. I just thought it was worth engaging with that and thinking about what design weights an individual piece in an individual game might have. We're now going to move on to like ways that games can talk about survivability in general. Evidently, Bionicme continues, an almost fully passive, fully invulnerable state is not quite what Warframe's developers want to have in their game. So what would a good solution be? I'm going to quote myself with a conversation with Nia, aka Milk Calf, someone else from our community Discord, earlier this month. You said, survivability like this is also kind of tricky to balance. You have to figure out how exactly you want high-level tanking to ideally look. If invulnerability isn't desirable, but tankiness just means being able to take hits and not die, where is the line between literal invulnerability and effective invulnerability? Probably within player action. The player has to do something. That could be the difference. But then what kind of actions should define it? Tanking should probably fail if you just stand there doing nothing. Should tanking succeed if you, for example, just keep melee attacking, for lifesteal perhaps? What conditions would there be for yes and no answers to that question? And how should a player act in response to those conditions to change the answer? I suppose the above line of questioning is also the main one for this parlay. Yep. I agree, that is kind of the core of this question. What does an engaging and also fair to the player, or fair in an interesting way at least, it doesn't have to be literally fair, but interesting, form of survivability look like in games? I have a lot of opinions about this subject. I actually don't think that this is a very complicated topic in a way. I think that a lot of games fuss about this, and there is in fact a I think rather clear sweet spot. And it is that you don't get one-shotted and you kind of push closer to getting two-shotted. Is sort of my theory. You give the player the chance to react and then make things deadly otherwise. If you want a game where the player slugs it out, usually I think it's nice for that to be based on investment. You know, the player builds to be tanky. In Warframe, this would mean most Warframes are expecting to get two-shotted unless the player intervenes. And other Warframes who build to be tanky prepare more for getting hit more times and then don't get two-shotted, but they do have to do more to not get two-shotted. So for example, this could mean the Warframe has a bigger health pool and they rely on lifesteal to stay alive. They don't get two-shotted, but at the cost of additional player input, whereas other Warframes plan to get two-shotted. It doesn't have to be literally 2 hits, by the way, obviously. Just enough that the player can react, but then there's still a lot of tension. So not one, but not like 10 hits, you know. and that the player just plays normally, maybe, and absorbs a few hits here and there. That doesn't one-shot them, but if they're in danger, they have to react or they could die. That, I think, is the baseline coherent form of difficulty. I believe it is somewhat objective that getting one-shotted is sort of just bad in a lot of game designs. In your Souls-like, for example, if a boss would one-shot you, and then you take that same boss, you don't change its or your mechanics, but you double its health and you halve its damage, you now have to succeed the same amount of times, more or less, but you just get to try more. You know, if you get hit, you don't die immediately, you are still in the fight, but you have to avoid getting hit a similar number of times. You just get to keep trying the fight if you get hit one time. That tension is now part of the game. I think that this is not really easier. It's essentially just you get to play more. You don't have to run back to the fight as much. You're probably still going to die a lot if you're getting 2 or 3 shot, right? And indeed, a lot of the Souls games do this thing where if you get hit and you immediately reflexively try to heal, the attacks are programmed in such a way that you usually die, building that tension by forcing you to try to continue dodging attacks, even though you've now taken 1 hit and you know you want to heal. The player has to react and feel that emotional pressure, and then find an opening to heal, and then it's sort of part of the game. The Souls games, of course, are notorious, in many ways famous, for having a very coherent, a very established form of what they think difficulty and survivability are supposed to look like. And as a result, even though I think the balancing of those games is often not especially strong, it just goes to show the strength of having a coherent design philosophy about this subject, because the games at least have a target that they can try to hit. And so I've found that provided the player's willing to be flexible, you can get many of those fights to feel really, really fulfilling and crunchy, and like 2 or 3 good hits from the opponent is going to kill you. So you need to be very careful, very light on your feet, and you'll often survive like 1 hit and then a glancing blow, and you did survive now. You're getting 3 shot, I guess, but you have very little health, a scary small amount of health. So now even some chip damage can kill you, maybe a thrown or ranged attack, one of the enemy's spacing tools or something. And I think that is a very coherent model of difficulty. A model of difficulty that I am, to be blunt, not entirely sure why games don't use as a kind of baseline. You know, I've got a lot of sympathy for this. You don't have to have a philosophy career and reinvent the concept of human fulfillment in an activity to make any video game. But if you don't want to do that, that is certainly an aspect of game design. That is a thing that you do as a game designer. But if you don't want to do it, that's okay. I don't really know why you wouldn't then just use the model of difficulty that other games use. I'm not sure I'm willing to accept that it is game design if you don't at least study or take an interest, study is kind of the wrong word, take an interest in that type of topic. You don't have to reinvent that topic, but to not think about that topic is not really game design, in my humble opinion. So I do have a bit of a bone to pick with a lot of games difficulty models, because I feel like it's not that hard to have something like okay, and then it is difficult to balance these games once you have that model. But I feel like a lot of games just kind of don't have a real answer to like what is their like philosophy of difficulty. I think you really nailed it, Bionicme. Questions like, you know, should tanking succeed if you, for example, just keep melee attacking, like without particularly avoiding enemy attacks either. You know, there's a good amount of stuff in Warframe where you buff your Warframe with an ability, and then if you keep melee attacking, you're safe because you have lifesteal or defenses, or both, hopefully. But there are nullifier bubbles that will deactivate your abilities. So you can't just unga bunga melee into them. Well, you can, but you'd want to carefully melee the edge, or bring a gun that can destroy the nullifier bubble, drone, or just mow it down so that you can avoid that threat that kind of counters you a little bit. and some Xmas enemies might drain your energy. This might make it hard to maintain your ability that's keeping you alive. And so the player can kind of brawl, and it is kind of a game where you hack and slash through a group of enemies. As a horde shooter, Warframe has this thing where like you want the player to be able to kill a ton of enemies without engaging with each individual enemy, but the game also has some third-person action combat game kind of roots where sometimes you do want to need to react to the individual enemy. And indeed, this is a difficult model to balance the situation on, right? In a lot of games where you fight a huge horde of enemies, you traditionally don't need to avoid damage as carefully. You know, they're often literally just easier unilaterally. And that is sometimes true in Warframe, and other times the enemy has pretty punishing attacks that you need to take care to avoid. And combining those two things is challenging. However, I think it's still reasonable to start with getting two-shotted, and Warframe has done this. We have shield gating, as was discussed before, the idea that if you have any shields, you just can't outright die to normal hits hitting you. You will take one hit, get a very brief invulnerability window just intended to prevent like a machine gun from counting as one hit after one bullet hits you or something, you know, to make it feel like one event or instance can be absorbed. So a brief invulnerability window when your shield breaks, and then you can be killed. And there are various other ways you can prevent that. Fairly sensible, I think, in theory. I feel that Warframe is a really good case study in a concept in, I guess, like philosophy that I find very interesting and useful to think about, which I call propagation. This is the degree to which you have an idea or a maxim or a system for a way of doing things. Propagation is the degree to which you are consistent about applying that. You've propagated it to other areas of your life. So you might say, I think it's very important to pause and then think and then speak before responding to people, and treat conversations and our limited time talking with care, even when you do a series where you constantly spend 45 minutes waffling about some random thing in game design. But perhaps you are not an automaton and you don't do that perfectly in every waking deed. Wouldn't know anything about that. Of course we don't. That's fine. However, I do think that a lot of people don't try very much to propagate, or don't think about things as being propagatable. Indeed, I think the problem for many people is actually that they don't think about propagation. Not that they don't do it or try to when they've realized something would be a good system to apply somewhat universally, but that they don't think of things as being things you could apply somewhat universally, and they usually are. If you think about a system of difficulty, you know, anytime difficulty comes up in the game, I would want that to be pinned on a wall somewhere. That is how the game is built. Like, there's no need to like wonder again what to do about that. You will notice, if you start thinking about this, you will become very troubled by how a lot of games don't do this. And part of the reason is probably that they have big teams. Without getting into it too much here, if you have 100 people working on a game, it's a lot harder to propagate effectively, because you not only need to propagate things in your different ways of thinking about things in your life, different areas of your existence, but you also need to make that appreciable to other people. And not simply telling them an idea, but getting other people to really own an idea and then propagate it themselves is practically impossible. You know, the level of personal growth that one needs to do this with any skill at all is hard enough. You can't, there's almost nothing you can do to get other people to do that. And there isn't really a way to check if people do this without spending enormous amounts of time with them. So you can't just like only hire people that will think that way. For example, I mean, you could try, I'm sure, and I'm sure people do. I can think of companies, we won't talk about it here, that claim to or try to do this. But I think it's basically impossible, but there are some things you can do to try. So yeah, like I my sympathies. That being said, that doesn't necessarily mean that the solutions here are complicated. It could just be that it is hard to get them to happen naturally in a setting where the game is developed by a lot of people. But that's different from it being hard to figure out what would be a good solution, in my opinion. I think in Warframe, we will need to talk about this more. There are other issues, but I think it is worth embracing this core of this Parley's idea here. that there is a kind of basic need for a philosophy of difficulty in a lot of these games, and that a lot of players, I think you'll hear people say, if they had a good experience with this, they say that is objectively good as a way to have difficulty be. And I'm not sure it is. I think it as long as you can explain why you think that builds tension, think about my explanation and you can agree or disagree. I would love to hear that. But I think that as long as the player has agency and is playing the game and the game creates tension, those are the two ingredients, and those ingredients usually come up when the player dies in a small but not one number of hits, single number of hits. Continuing on. It is likely a good design principle we had been talking about. I'm just rereading this part briefly to give you a little framing. To draw the line between success and failure for survivability in the hands of the player, rewarding their active participation with success while making sure passive inaction will lead to failure in ensuring survivability. Unless perhaps the player has gone to great lengths and made significant trade-offs to specifically make a build that can effectively become immortal with little to no active input, which could be considered active participation in a different way. Sure. Or let the player like potentially defeat the game on the build screen. The technology victory in, is that what it's called in Civilization? And you know what I'm talking about if you play those games. Valkyr's current design is meant to encourage active play with the high energy drain on the invulnerability and the retaliatory damage if you play too passively and took too much damage while it was active, then didn't make sure there were no enemies nearby when deactivating. But these factors have not proven to be sufficient to fulfill their purpose. Right, it's just too easy in a game as open-ended as Warframe to make the ability be active an amount of time that makes it not risky. And it's easy to get away from enemies. It's hard for enemies to be near you in a way that matters after you took a lot of damage. But issues can come up, Bionicme continues, when emphasizing active tanking without giving the players a passive fallback. I love this part. In a fast-paced game like Warframe, at higher levels where even significant amounts of damage reduction start to buckle under enemy output, being knocked out by a stray attack from an elite enemy that caught you off guard is not only possible, but likely the only bad thing that will happen to you. And at some point, this will begin to undermine the player's agency, as even their best efforts to actively play might come up short. Hence, the preferred approaches for high-level survivability tend to be more absolute, effective, if temporary, invulnerability in some form, such as shield gating. Nia also brought up the idea of letting Valkyr use health gating, or maybe something akin to Warframe mini-boss's controversial damage attenuation system, the adaptation mod comes to mind, where enemies dynamically take drastically less damage the more damage they take. Both in that conversation and in this parlay, I'll bring up a similar system that Last Epoch uses for its players. There's an endurance stat in that game, in two parts. So this is like a form of combining damage reduction and kind of a passive general tankiness with damage or shield gating or one-shot protection. Also passive, but like single fallback option. This endurance stat in Last Epoch. One percentage that caps out at 60% for damage reduction, and one flat number attached to this stat with no cap that indicates the amount of health you need to be below for the damage reduction to take effect. Notably, any hit that would bring you below the threshold also gets that amount that exceeded the threshold reduced. That won't make sense on its own. Here's an example. You have 100 health, and you have an endurance stat of 60% with the threshold set to 50. This means that when you take a hit that brings you below 50 health, of your 100 health in this example, you get 60% damage reduction. An incoming packet of 100 damage when you have full health would end up dealing 70 damage. The first 50 damage will be unaffected and will bring you to 50 health, and the remaining 50 damage will be reduced by 60% to 20, which will mean you'll take 70 total damage. While ultimately not guaranteeing survival, such a system at least affords the player more time to react during intense situations. Straight-up preventions of death are a fairly common design choice too, usually with a cooldown or other drawback. Warframe already has the Quick Thinking mod, which drains your energy as an emergency survivability measure. And the new Valkyr's invulnerability on death effect seems very potent, maybe enough so that players can skip other survivability investment entirely, which would not be great either. Indeed, that is basically the same problem with the existing design, or the previous design. Yes, I think that these types of one-shot protection systems are pretty interesting. There's a memorable one for me in Risk of Rain 2 that, to oversimplify, basically means if you are above 90% health, hits that would one-shot you will leave you with, I believe, about 10% health. If you can heal back up fast enough, now you need to heal a huge amount of health, you may be able to get back to that 90% so fast that you'll get one-shot protection again. But it's very difficult to avoid every single hit in Risk of Rain 2. So continuing to do damage while avoiding a lot of attacks rewards you very highly as long as you have lifesteal, and there are a number of sources of lifesteal or healing on kill. And this creates a pretty engaging gameplay loop where the player has to be super active, actually more active, not just avoiding attacks, but they actually need to be also killing enemies, usually, to get that one-shot protection, where if they don't manage to avoid every single hit, their supreme output of dodging most attacks and also being able to damage enemies and kill them has rewarded them with some protection against a few of the game's, hardest to avoid attacks. And I think this is a good model in theory. It kind of embraces the idea, Bionicme, you brought up, that you're rewarding the player's activity with survivability in a more nuanced way. More activity equals more survivability. If you do more stuff, you get more safe. What does that mean in a game where you just dodge attacks? Well, it means you also multitask and do damage to enemies at the same time. I think that's a pretty compelling model of difficulty. And it creates this weird Wild West shootout experience in Risk of Rain 2, where at medium to high scaling levels, you run out in front of the enemies, quickly unload as much damage as you possibly can, and then run away, because both your and their damage combos will just explode huge groups of enemies or your entire health bar in 1 second. And you very rarely die in Risk of Rain 2 at higher levels by getting chipped down. Usually you lose that Wild West shootout. That's what will happen. Or your damage combo and therefore healing falls down enough that you can't keep getting back your one-shot protection, or you need it too often because you can't kill enough enemies, something like that. That's a little reductive. People who play Risk of Rain 2, hopefully you can accept it's close enough for people to get the idea. Yeah, I think this is a case where really the problem in Warframe, some people who play Warframe might have thought 60% damage reduction, that's terrible. But it probably shouldn't be that terrible. In Warframe, there's this weird phenomenon where 90% damage reduction is nothing and bad, and often it's around 99% damage reduction that you feel actually a bit safe, which is very achievable on many Warframes, almost all Warframes in my opinion. You can get kind of passively tanky to the point where most Steel Path difficulty, the game's hard mode of missions, which is not the hardest content the game has on offer, but is at least a benchmark, will be survivable for most Warframes. You won't get one-shotted very much, and usually you'll have time to react, plus shield gating. But combining a game where there are a ton of enemies, and you're kind of not meant to be able to nimbly dodge between them as much as just kind of move, and their attacks are mostly locking onto you, does create its problems. I mean, we've gotten to a point where the game has just spiraled out of control a little. I want to suggest that in Warframe's case, it's more that it being an ongoing game or a live service is why these things have gotten out of hand in a way that they normally wouldn't. You normally would have just stopped a while ago, noticing that you'd at some point hit a sweet spot for Warframe's difficulty. I would say that it was about around arbitrations and the Steel Path, personally. And I feel that for a little while now, the game's difficulty has somewhat spiraled out of control into what previously I had written off as saying, if people spend 5 hours in an endurance run in a survival mission, the game gets really hard, but hard in a way where you just instantly die, and the build system isn't really interesting anymore, and a lot of the game doesn't really work. You might enjoy that aspect of the game, that's fine. But looking at it from the perspective of game design, is the game about those things? The game has a lot of systems that don't matter with that form of difficulty. For players that enjoy that makes them never mind. But ought the game to be targeting that type of difficulty? I'm not sure. At the very least, most of the game's existing design doesn't really work at those levels. And now we've gotten to the point where the game is approaching those levels as its stated, formal, intended difficulty. You can see how there might be a problem with that. Players that enjoy it, and there are a few, that's fantastic. But that doesn't have to do with whether it's a good idea for the game's design. I feel neither here nor there. I'm actually pretty interested to play some of this kind of content because I haven't had that much time to in the recent months and years. So I'm looking forward to digging into it. Things like the debark medias. But I do think that from a design perspective, it raises some questions. Does Warframe's design really support this? Why is this here other than that the game must continue because that's its business model? You see what I mean? And I'll actually go a little further. Why are a lot of players continuing to play just this one game? Other than that, other games might take a little bit of time to get into, and this game just does still have stuff coming out. You know, I'm not sure it totally makes sense to need to just die on the hill of this one form of difficulty, even as it spirals out of control. People want it because they feel like they have their thing that's cozy to them. But when your thing that's cozy to you is an ongoing game, a live service that constantly has to change forever, you're trying to become cozy with something that is required to remove your comfort, which that obviously doesn't work. Like, there's no need. You don't have to like wait for that to not work. It won't work. There are totally games where you can get that. But I don't think that Warframe and games like it are among them. It would be a game that if you're going to play it for more than a year or two, you're going to need to be willing to see it change its model of difficulty because it's required to change its model of difficulty. And from a design perspective, this means you are doomed. You know, there really is no way out of that situation. You can't make a game have coherent balance forever any more than you can stop the entropy of the universe. Well, I'm open-minded. Perhaps you can do that, but I highly doubt that with the noble yet humble task of being a game developer, you will halt entropy. It's going to be that the game's balance is going to be damaged and its model of difficulty marred and inevitably needing to be transformed. But I'm not trying to say it's like not possible to do. The last thing I wanted to talk about is the way that the game, the attitude the game takes toward changes. Something I've been thinking about for a long time is that although it isn't practical for most games, I think you could make a game that was kind of attempted to fight the entropy of being like decaying in its balance, whether it was an ongoing game or not. You could make systems that were kind of designed with rules that meant either we will come to a true dead end and it will be revealed that this design cannot be made into compelling difficulty while being balanced and having an interesting build system, or it will have a balanced and interesting build system for a long time. Some of those rules would be things like if a weapon does a lot or the most or a unique thing, making it not do other things very well tends to make it more balanced. If a weapon does multiple things, making it do less of them than weapons that do, you know, just one thing, for example, usually results in better balance, and those things might seem obvious on their own. But again, if you fully propagate that idea to every single waking moment of the game's existence, you can get games that are surprisingly broad, but have a lot of meaningful different options while still retaining coherent difficulty. That's hard to do. That's difficult. I think that a thing that is wearing on a lot of people who play Warframe specifically is that the developer is quite nerf heavy. Like, they're quite prone to just completely changing or weakening things rather than buffing them. Now, I'm a big proponent of nerfs. I think that people have gone way too far with a channel I like making a video I think is titled badly. There's a video called like why buffing is better than nerfing, or why buffs are better than nerfs. And they're not. Players like them more because that's what most of the video actually talks about. But from a game design perspective, no, nerfing things is often much cleaner. You know, reducing the game's complexity is one of the main benefits of a nerf. Just taking away an effect or making something unable to be used in a way can often be the much more elegant solution. And it's just that it will upset players who don't understand where the change is coming from. The first step then is to get players to understand where the change is coming from. And I've been frustrated with Warframe in the past about this. There have been times where a nerf was made to a thing in the game. I thought that the nerf was a good game design decision. I don't care how I feel about it from a personal play decision. I want the game to have compelling options, so if something makes the game more balanced, I want it, regardless of whether it's a buff or a nerf, and regardless of whether it affects things I like or not, because it makes me have more fun in the medium term for the game to be that way. But most players don't feel like that. And in the stream where they made this announcement, they explained why they had done the nerf. But their explanation was, it's complicated, right? Like, wrong, I would say, in terms of game design theory. They said because a lot of players are using it. Like, but that's like a reason. It's like that thing where people say, why are you doing this? They go, oh, it's like, this is just how I am. It's like, no, there is a reason. Like, so you're just saying you don't know what the reason is. Like, why is that how you currently are? You could have been another way. Something caused you to be this way. This is just the way you are. Isn't really a reason. We can accept that we don't know why you're like that. You have to do this in life many times. But that isn't a reason why the thing is that way. And this was an answer like that, right? Because players are using it too much. Okay, but like, why is that bad? Why are players using it a lot? And they kind of explain that, but not really. And so the result is that players got the message, the exact wrong message, that if something is used by a large number of players, the developers will antagonistically take it away. And the reason is because a lot of people are using it. This is the worst possible thing you could say, because it ignites the toxic thing that communities like this say, that the developer hates fun. They blatantly obviously don't. Although in this case, I think they are guilty of failing to embrace fun. They're not giving the explanation that explains why it would lead to fun to nerf this thing. I, again, found this a frustrating moment because I believe that the change they made does lead to more fun by causing it to be the case that this item is still good, and I believe it still was good, but just not as overwhelmingly the best option. Now more things are good, while not making this actually bad, simply just not so much better that it was pointless to use anything else, leading to it being fun and effective to use other options. That's why it leads to more fun. It's not complicated why nerfing things leads to more fun. It often does. But I'm flabbergasted when I hear developers talk about this subject that they don't seem able to just say why that is. And it's possible that that's because that isn't why they did it, which I don't think is very good. That's bad. It could just be that they don't know what to do. Warframe is a complicated, involved game, and the existing design team didn't make all of it. You know, it was made over the course of 10 years by a shifting cast. And as a result, I've got a lot of sympathy for the feeling like you have to kind of band-aid everything, but it will never work. You know, that's not going to result in a coherent and compelling balance. And indeed, I've really fallen off with my interest in Warframe's gameplay because I think it just doesn't really work at a lot of the game's suggested difficulties. It's either too easy to make it impossible to fail or too hard to make it impossible to fail. You know, it becomes hard enough that the few Warframes that can basically just delete damage as an issue become the only sensible choice. And then there are difficulties where that's not true, at which it's too easy to make everything a non-threat. And I just don't really think the game's difficulty works, and hasn't for a long time, at least in my opinion. But again, I'm looking forward to playing the harder stuff on offer. It's possible they figured out a solution, but I don't know. You know, I don't think it's going to stay that way. As always, Warframe has been a helpful example in my career as a whole historically, because it's such a mutable thing that has had so many interesting, unique design problems. However, I personally think this is a case where the underlying, very deeply underlying, motivation behind the changes made to the game just doesn't really lead to a satisfying gameplay loop or kind of a result for the players. There are games out there that nerf things a lot, and the player base kind of is with it, because the nerfs are on target enough, gentle enough, and explained enough that the community just kind of understands to an extent. Or that's at least the public-facing sentiment of the community, for whatever that's worth. And Warframe is not one of them, at least not in my experience. And I think the community is right for the wrong reasons. You know, it's not bad to nerf things and try to balance the game. The reasons they are giving to do that have been not that good in the past, and I'm not sure the results are really there. But is the idea sensible? I think it couldn't be anything but. You know, it can be fun for the game to be balanced, and having a coherent form of difficulty can be a lot of fun, but I don't know if it's entirely there. Now, obviously, we shouldn't do this parlay without at least noting that Warframe does have a kind of interesting model of difficulty itself, or at least it has in the past, which is that usually you are not the thing you need to defend. It's like an objective or an area you have to capture, you have to kill something quickly. Actually killing something or staying alive are not very hard, and so embracing a kind of outside the box model of difficulty where you're fighting a battle and you've got to win the battle or defend the objective in this case, it makes more sense as a model of difficulty, and is an interesting way to do a power fantasy game where the player isn't really meant to be in that much danger themselves and is a legendary war hero, basically. Therefore, the big problem is other stuff getting destroyed. Makes sense. I have at times felt like to make the game then challenging, the game has to throw something you kind of can't easily interact with at you. I think back to many times where until I found or they added indicators enough that I knew where targets were coming to destroy like control points in defensive missions with multiple objectives, or what's that? I always forget what this mission is called. Not defection. The thing where you put the colored keys, people who play Warframe, you know what I'm talking about. The colored keys into the slots and then a guy comes to blow it up. Those, to me, it was always like, well, if I knew where the enemy was coming from, this can't be hard. And if I don't know where the enemy's coming from, it can't be beat. So there really isn't a mid-ground where, unless the enemy has a kind of stupid amount of health, it can't easily be difficult in many cases, without like a kind of specific amount of distance the enemy has to walk where I know it's there, but it has like a little, not too much, not too little time before it gets to the objective. And let's just say I don't think that the levels that mission type takes place on are balanced in that way. So yeah, it will be interesting to talk about this with other games. But I think you've picked a really good starting point, that there's a sort of philosophy of difficulty. And I wanted to kind of leave with the point that it can be kind of, it could be that it's revealed that it is flawed. You know, there might be ways to fix it, yet at the same time, the live service ongoing development model means we've arrived at the conclusion that it doesn't easily work. Like that, it can just be sort of a dead end-ish of game design, even though I'm sure there is some way to make it work. There might not be a practical or easy to think of way to make it work. And that can be revealed. I think a lot of people, when these things come up, don't entertain the idea that it can be kind of a dead end. If you don't diagnose the formula for the game's difficulty or whatever before the game is developed to an extent, don't at least try to look ahead, it's reasonably likely that the game essence, the thing that is meant to be the kind of push and pull of the game, will literally just not work when we get to the end of the line. And that you might be able to fix it, but I mean, that can be very hard to do. So I have a lot of sympathy for Warframe's dev team. I hope this didn't come across as like unnecessarily critical, but I do think it is a losing battle. And for Warframe, I'm thankful that I am not a Warframe YouTuber, I guess is what I have to say, and am instead able to just discuss the game design because it's extremely fascinating, in my opinion, but would not be fun to have it be my career. Sorry, / thank you. Thanks to the parlay, Bionicme. If you want to submit your own parlay like this, you can do that using a link in the description. We'd love to have you. You can ask whatever you want. It can be about game design stuff or video game stuff, games we've mutually played that you've seen on my game spreadsheet, or just other things, other non-related things, whatever you like. We'd love to have you. Looking forward to the next one. Yeah, do more of these. I mean, do whatever you want, of course, Bionicme. But I would love to see more of a series about survivability in games. It's an interesting topic that games have a surprising amount of solutions to, though it will be interesting to see if my claim holds up, that the core of what makes survivability in games satisfying is actually pretty simple, according to me, and it is essentially, like, fundamentally it is being two-shotted, or like 2 or 3-shotted, and that is the like ideal game essence that a lot of people say they like games where that doesn't happen, but I think those games are generally just a version of that same philosophy, and are often at their best for most people when you are getting two-shotted. Again, a lot of people like no-hit runs in a game like Dark Souls. I would just argue that the bulk of the people playing those games do not enjoy the game that way. They primarily enjoy that two-shot model. That's a fairly strong claim, but I'm happy to challenge it. Let's see if that's true. So yeah, I would love to see more of these.